So, the internet is no better or worse than anything else in history. I think that it's made more people feel like they're designers is great. Then you judge their design based on what they're doing, not on the tool that they used.
Welcome everybody, here is Mario and welcome to a new episode of Design Interviews and Questions, where we try to generate and share good content for people and making people feel the support of the design world. So while everything is stopping, unfortunately, we talk about design, and today we do it with Steven Heller. Steven is the co-founder and co-chair of the MFA Design Designers as Entrepreneur program at the School of Visual Art in New York. For also 33 years, he was the senior art director of the New York Times. You probably know him because he is the author or the editor or the co-author of over 190 books on graphic design. So, of course, you read one of them for sure. He also received the AIGA Medal for Lifetime Achievement and the Smithsonian National Design Award for Design Mind. So basically, we are in front of an icon of graphic design world. So welcome, Steven. Happy to have you here.
Thank you, Mario. Good to be here. Good to be, well, let's say I'm here and I'd rather be there. And I'm sure you'd rather be someplace else too.
Yeah, well, we try to do our best in this moment. And I hope everyone is okay at the moment. And you too.
Thank you. I hope so too.
So if you would not mind, I would start letting you know that, as I always remember to all the interviewees, you're totally free to answer whatever you want. So just feel free.
Great.
And so I would start with the first question, the starting question, which is, what made you become a designer?
Well, what made me become a designer was that I was wanting to be an illustrator. And more specifically, I wanted to be a satiric cartoonist. I wanted to do things that were funny and absurd and communicated my own inner feelings with other people. And that led me to graphic design. And it led me to graphic design because so many of the illustrators that I admired from other times and places also were designers, in the sense that they did posters or they did books or they did lettering. And it all kind of came together when I was 16 or 17, and I joined the staff of an underground left-wing newspaper in New York, where I did cartoons, but I also did paste up and mechanicals, which was the equivalent of using InDesign in the 1960s.
Okay, so we said that you were the art director of the New York Times. So for you, it was very important to somehow share information and how to share this information. So is this for you design is like sharing information and messages through visual languages, or like, of course, letters and so on? For
well, I was a senior designer at the New York Times. I was actually the only senior designer, but there was a chief designer who was later became an assistant managing editor of design and became the creative director of the Times. I was hired by a great designer named Lou Silverstein, and worked with the creative director later on, Tom Bodkin. But working for a newspaper was, and particularly the New York Times, which as I was growing up was the greatest newspaper in the world and still is, was a great honor and a great thrill. I wanted to inject a certain kind of illustration into the paper, which it had already experienced and pioneered, which we call conceptual illustration. It was illustration that kind of spoke on its own and was complementary to a particular article, or sometimes antagonistic to a particular article. And so it was conveying information for sure, but it was conveying a kind of personal interpretation of that information. And that's odd at a newspaper, because the newspaper is supposed to be about fact. The New York Times was broken into a kind of church and state. One part of that was the news, and the news you couldn't tamper with. That's what reporting is all about. That's what journalism is all about. But there was also critique and commentary, and that's where, you know, a personal or an institutional position is introduced. And I worked for many years on the op-ed page, which is where the commentators and the columnists resided. And then for 30 years, I worked on the New York Times Book Review, which was all about criticism.
So for you, then design is?
For me, design is a lot of things. Design is everything. Design, you know, is what I'm wearing. Design is what I'm reading. Design is what I'm seeing in the environment. Design is the ordering of material, whether it's information or physical objects. Design is, as Paul Rand said, everywhere. It is an essential part of our life. It is the Garden of Eden.
So if I would ask you what were you creating as a designer beyond the simple, you know, just surface of the outcome?
What was a sense of being, of existing, of making something that an audience would either learn from or be entertained by. What I loved about design is that it was a puzzle, and you had a lot of little pieces and you put it together and you had to make it aesthetically pleasing while at the same time meaningful on one hand. On the other hand, design is an experience. And so what I tried to do was make an environment or a frame for something to happen, and for people to experience that piece of work.
And you designed a lot. You designed, I mean, I'm using the word design because you said that the design is somehow everything. So like you, let's say you did a lot of books, you teach, you made a lot of things in the field of graphic design. But for you, the process was somehow always the same? Because, for example, Massimo Vignelli he said that for him, to design a car, to design a poster, a book, or whatever was okay. The ingredients change, but the recipe, the process, how you design in general is always the same. Do you agree?
Oh, I agree with Massimo, but that's not what I did. For me, the ingredients changed and the reason changed and the methodology changed, but I always saw things through the lens of design. You know, Massimo was the inveterate designer. He lived design. I live in design. Massimo was design. I was a practitioner of design, and now I'm a commentator, an observer, a historian of design. So I look at design in a less holistic way on one side and a more holistic way on the other. But I'm not Massimo Vignelli. Massimo had a kind of presence about him and an excitement that, you know, he was the monument to design. So to even come close to saying that I was like him would be false, but to say that I agree with him is true. So what I do, you know, when I create books, I'm not designing those books, I'm writing those books. Now, I've made the case that writing is design because you're trying to create sentences and paragraphs and chapters and stories, and a design is a story. But I'm looking at it very broadly. And I think Massimo was looking at design broadly, but also narrowly.
Yeah, I totally got your point and understand. Um, you saw a lot of things. I mean, every day today we see a lot of things also on Instagram. You're on Instagram, so we see too much maybe. But do you think perfection exists in design?
Well, for somebody like Massimo, perfection had to exist. That was one of his definitions of design. For me, perfection is a trap. It's something we try to attain, and unless we're totally convinced of what we're doing, we will never attain it because there'll always be doubt. And I think that really great design, the design that lasts for the ages, it's imbued with the idea of perfection. We look at something, a piece of architecture, a piece of sculpture, and we say it couldn't have been done better. I don't know whether we mean it or not, but culture tells us it couldn't have been done better and therefore it's perfect. There's nothing I've ever done that was perfect because I have doubt. And as long as I have doubt, there can be no conclusion.
And you comes from another generation, a previous generation of this one. So as you said, when you replied to the first question, you started with another generation of tools, so no computers and so on. So now you're living in the contemporary generation and you're also educating contemporary generations. So what do you think about contemporary design?
Well, there's a lot of contemporary design that I really enjoy. You know, I mentioned entertainment. And when I look at design, I want to be entertained. A book that I'm working on right now is called Type Speaks. And it is about lettering and typography and typefaces that have certain emotional characteristics that are implied or implicit. And many of those typefaces, if you talk to a purist typographer, will say they're crap or they're imperfect. That's in the eye of the beholder. And ultimately, there are rules, and many of the rules are broken, like the poster behind you right now. Massimo Vignelli would say that's a piece of crap. I would say that's an interesting approach to language. There's a poster over here, which you can't see, which uses figurative illustration to get the point across. There are many designers who I've written about who would look at that poster and say it's kitsch. Look at that poster and say, what's wrong with kitsch? So contemporary design is often looked upon as kitsch when you see it for the first time, and it's breaking rules or taboos. And then over time, it either falls away because maybe it just isn't of no interest to anybody, or it rises in the social order, the cultural order, the aesthetic order, and it becomes something that we would call classic. And from classic, you can go to timeless. So there are contemporary designers working now whose work we may look at in 50 years and say that was classic of its time, and it transcends its time and becomes timeless. But these are all theoretical and they're all subjective points of view.
Do you think internet had a good impact on design or had a bad impact on design? Because for me, when I talk about this with people in general, not just in these interviews, people are like split into opposite parts. In one hand, people say, yeah, internet opened the world of design to anyone because you just need to have an iPhone with internet. On the other end, there is the other part that say, yeah, well, but then now the world of graphic design or in design in general is totally saturated. So,
well, my answer to the question is the internet hasn't done anything worse to design than the printing press. It's democratized, and at the same time, it's allowed authoritarians to spread messages. And some of those messages look better than they did when they didn't have internet template or design templates from the internet. It's a tool. It's like asking whether the Roman Empire was bad for the planet Earth. It was bad for people whose lands it occupied and whose people were subjugated by Caesar. And it was good for many people because it brought, certain learning and scholarship along with it. It changed the way people thought, used agriculture, whatever. So, the internet is no better or worse than anything else in history. I think that it's made more people feel like they're designers is great. Then you judge their design based on what they're doing, not on the tool that they used.
when I introduced you, I said that you contributed in different ways as an author, co-author, or editor of more than 190 books about graphic design. So in a way, you try to keep the design in something, you know, with books, and you're also a teacher. So for you, this thing of what is graphic design, how is graphic design, and so on all his aspects, uh, is important. What do you think about the education in design?
Well, education is going to change a lot because of what's going on right now. The virus has put us all online, and if that's good, it's good. And if it changes the way we think about education, we're going to see soon enough. I think design education has been good in some cases and not so good in others. It really depends on how you're being taught and with what ideas you're learning. The idea that designers now have to spend so much time using equipment that they hadn't had to use 30 years ago means that there's a requirement for more education, more time to be educated. And I'm in favor of having more time to do when you have to pay for it and you want to get started right away. But on the other hand, you look at the legal profession, or more specifically the medical profession, and doctors have to spend an awful lot of time in school or in residencies or internships learning the skill of medicine. So graphic design is not like medicine, but it requires a considerable amount of skill as well as perspective. And you'll get that as you work, as you develop, as you mature. But some people get it in a better way. It's delivered in a better way than, other people who get, let's say, the inferior teacher or the inferior program, or can only learn a certain way. Education is a challenge. I have co-founded a number of design programs, but I don't think of myself as a teacher. I think of myself as a lecturer. And at the moment, I'm actually having a certain amount of doubt, a certain amount of reevaluation going on what about and how much in the education of a designer.
You comes from, as we said already, another generation, and you write a lot on graphic design and so on. So you saw somehow the development of the role of the designer in the world, because for example, in the previous interview, we talked with Massimo Pittis of Pittis Associati, a studio here in Milan, about how for him 90% of designers today, they translate somehow the concept from the clients into graphics, but the 10%, they create the content and they are the curator of the content. So they do not just work for the clients, but they also create and generate this content. Do you think, sorry?
Go ahead.
Do you think the role of the designer, it will go in this direction? So it will become more content creator and not just form creator, let's say?
Well, the School of Visual Arts MFA Design Designers Entrepreneur Program, which we started 22 years ago. I started it with Lita Tellerico. The whole point of the program was to create content. And it had been happening in many ways prior to that. Massimo Vignelli created clothing and products. Lila Vignelli created jewelry. Pushpin Studios created their own products as well. Many designers developed books and movies. All media were open to designers. So design has always been a balance between creating content and solving problems. Or you could put it another way, creating problems and solving problems. It's not that all design will become that, because there are still corporations, businesses, individuals, art forms, institutions that need branding or corporate identity or a simple brochure, and a designer is going to have to do that. So they're doing service. But I think the present and the future is going to include designers who create their own content, who develop their own ideas. And part of that has to do with the digital revolution, because we have all these tools in front of us. Because if you learn the right coding or the right program, you can make things that you wouldn't have made otherwise. And there's also more collaboration. So a company that will ask you to create a logo may also ask you to create the environment around the logo, the brand story within the product. So you become a partner as opposed to an employee. And I think more and more designers will move into that partnership role as collaborators on content, if not creators of content.
Now we arrive to the last and 10th question. We before the interview, we talked a bit about this situation regarding this global pandemic, which is really bad, and I hope everyone are fine who is watching this interview, but also the other people. What I want to ask you is, do you think the designer, let's say the graphic designer, because we especially talking about graphic design, but can do something for this global pandemic, or we cannot do anything and we just have to wait until this drama ends?
Well, I think there are two answers to that, yes and no. Designers can certainly help in the distribution, dissemination of information. And as you mentioned a moment ago, maybe there's too much stuff on the internet. TMI, too much information. And designers can help edit that information and then format that information and present that information. They can also disseminate misinformation. So there's a yin and yang there. So within that context, there's a yes and there's a no. Will designers find a cure for this or any other virus? No, not unless they are chemists or biologists or physicists or scientists of some kind. But so many designers are more than just designers. Design happens to be the tool that they're working with at the moment. But I've known designers who have gone into other fields, including occupational therapy, including psychology. And they've used their design knowledge within those professions. So one thing I'd say, going back to your question about education, is you could be educated as a designer and be something else as a professional. You could be a lawyer and run a restaurant. You know, we're not stuck in a guild. We're not stuck in medieval trades. We're free to do anything. Will we be able to cure the epidemic? I'm not, and I don't know anybody that can, but I think we're able to help clean up and help repair what the epidemic leaves in its path. Just the same way after the Great Depression in the United States, designers, industrial designers, graphic designers, sought ways to change the way products and images were used in the world. And after World War II, designers, architects, and graphic designers specifically also helped change things. One of people I've written about a lot is Ladislav Sutnar, a Czech designer who came to the United States and changed the way information was presented, the way catalogs were designed. And that was a very important thing because he took chaos and made it order. So graphic designers are, you know, here in the United States, we're told essential personnel can go out into the street and go to work. Graphic designers are not considered essential personnel in that context. Whereas my doorman downstairs is considered an essential person. And he is an essential person to my life, but designers are essential to all of our lives. So I think ultimately the answer to your question is yes, in a very general way.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It was very nice to hear your answers and very inspiring words regarding all the questions. I mean, I said at the beginning, you're like an icon of the world of graphic design. So thank you for being here and your support to this project.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. It's great to feel like there's a world out there after being cooped up for so long.
Thank you very much.